So good morning, everyone. I'd like to express my sincerest gratitude to you all for being here. I particularly want to thank Teo, Tom, Zrinka, and everyone at UCLA's CMRS Center for Early Global Studies for the gracious invitation to participate in this conference. When I was here in 2018, I was sitting in the back. I was still a grad student making notes meticulously. And we might see some of your thoughts and ideas here, right? So I owe a great debt to almost everyone in this room. Thank you to Erin Romo for all her efforts in organizing and coordinating this event. And it is a tremendous honor to be here in the company of so many teachers and colleagues from whom I continue to learn every day. So my talk today explores, and it really sort of takes Tom up on his sets of questions. So if there's something muddled here, it's because I realized that 2 days is not enough to think through these questions. I'm just going to put a bunch of things on the table. So my talk tries to explore the convergence between Nasrid discourses about ethno-religious identity and the complex borderland realities of the Muslim-Christian frontier in 14th century Iberia. Over the course of the next 20 minutes or so, I will try to offer some new insights into that vexed question of diversity, inclusion, and exclusion in the late medieval Iberian world through a close examination of the works of the Nasrid scholar-statesman, Lisān ibn al-Khaṭīb. His writings allow us to better understand and appreciate the ways in which the organization of communal identity around notions of ethnic homogeneity and religious exclusivity in Nasrid Granada involved the marginalization, omission, and erasure of Christian communities and lineages from the collective memory of Andalusi Muslims. Even as he was engaged in this endeavor, however, various groups of Iberian Christians can be encountered everywhere in the writings of the Lisān ibn al-Khaṭīb. This can be seen in passages and entire pages, reproduced from the chronicles and documents of earlier Andalusi authors, his own writings about Latin Christendom, including the Iberian Christian kingdoms, and even the incorporation of a substantial translation into Arabic of a large portion of Alfonso X's Historia de España. So this paper seeks to situate Ibn al-Khaṭīb's strategies of compilation and his monumental comprehensive history of Granada within the broader milieu of the Nasrid Castilian borderlands during the 14th century. It is my contention that the representation of Christians in medieval Granada within this history was intimately tied to the articulation of communal memory and local identity, and should be understood in light of Ibn al-Khaṭīb's commitments to upholding the genealogical notion of Arabness, and I'll be talking quite a bit about this, which he sought to represent as the defining characteristic of the region and its inhabitants. These writings reflect the interplay and tensions between a triumphalist representation of Nasrid Granada as a fortified borderland of Islam, characterized by religious purity, on one hand, and the strong sense of foreboding expressed by Andalusi authors about the fragility of the entire endeavor of Muslim sovereignty in Iberia in light of the looming threat of Castilian conquest. This was the age, after all, of Alfonso XI that we're talking about. So this talk is divided into 3 portions, just to signpost a little bit for you. After a brief overview of the larger context, I'm going to discuss the notion of Arabness as an integral component of the articulation of communal boundaries and ideas about inclusion and exclusion. The second part looks at the ways in which Ibn al-Khaṭīb mobilizes one particular historical event, the Almoravid deportation and expulsion of the Mozarab communities of Granada around 1126, as a reflection of the importance of the idea of Christian lineage, and fashioning Nasrid discourses about ethnic homogeneity and religious exclusivity. I'll end with a consideration of the question of the erasure of Christian lineage from the Nasrid histories of Al-Andalus in the late medieval period, while illustrating how authors such as Ibn al-Khaṭīb sought to invoke selectively Christian descent as a marker of religious deviance and political disloyalty in specific cases. So although the specifics of Nasrid history and politics during the 14th century might not need any introduction to the audience I'm speaking to here, it might still be instructive to give you a sense of the context in which Ibn al-Khaṭīb was operating. So by the 14th century, the Kingdom of Granada encompasses one of the most populous, urban, and diverse populations in late medieval Spain. Following the fragmentation of the Almohad Caliphate during the 13th century, and the ensuing mass migration of thousands of Andalusi Muslims to the region in the wake of the Castilian, Portuguese, and Aragonese conquests of large swathes of Islamic Spain, Granada is transformed from a regional center into one of the largest cities in the Islamic West. Recent studies have challenged the conventional narrative of Nasrid decline and isolation by illustrating Granada's integration into the extensive intellectual, mercantile, commercial, and diplomatic networks that characterized the late medieval Mediterranean world. The social and cultural heterogeneity of Nasr Granada's population reflected this borderland context and encompassed various Jewish communities, bands of peripatetic Muslim mystics and scholars from across the Islamic world, including as far afield as Samarkand, significant contingents of North African holy warriors, the Huzat, that Hussein has written about, and a substantial presence of merchants from across the Mediterranean. Nasr Granada and its inhabitants, in other words, belong to a multitude of worlds and networks. And this is the question of networks and how they fashion discourses of inclusion and exclusion. So the population of Granada was characterized by social and cultural heterogeneity as well. The Andalusi Muslims who comprised the majority of the kingdom's roughly 250,000 inhabitants were themselves descendants of communities from various backgrounds, from across Iberia and beyond, the consequence of centuries of acculturation, conversion, and migration. And significantly, there were also substantial numbers of renegades, enslaved peoples and freedmen and their descendants who were an integral part of the kingdom's population. These included numerous military and political officials of Iberian Christian background and heritage, some of whom were appointed to leading positions of executive authority. So the Muslim-Christian frontier in this period, when we consider it closely, was characterized by intermittent frontier warfare and shifting alliances between Nasrid, Marinid, and Castilian rulers, the emergence of a borderland nobility that served as intermediaries between Nasr Granada and the Iberian Christian kingdoms, and the permeability of the frontier, which facilitated the passage and migration of mercenaries and merchants, renegades and refugees, scholars and slaves between the Islamic world and Latin Christendom. And it was this borderland context that shaped so many of the polemical discourses about identity and the boundaries of community during the 14th century. This is particularly evident in two outside representations of Nasr Granada by two prominent individuals and their circle. The first, Jean II of Aragon. Of the 200,000, these are his ambassadors talking really. Of the 200,000 individuals residing in Granada, he says, there are no more than 500 who are Muslim by nature, Saraceni de natura, or origin. The remainder are Christian by origin or have a Christian father, mother, grandfather, grandmother, great-grandfather, or great-grandmother. Moreover, there are 50,000 individuals who have openly abandoned the Christian faith and embraced the sect of Muhammad. Writing over 60 years later from North Africa, the North African scholar-statesman Abdurrahman ibn Khaldun had his own strong opinions about the Nasrid kingdom. In our own time, he tells us, the Andalusis imitate and assimilate themselves to the Iberian Christian nations in their dress, their emblems, and their symbols, and in many of their customs and manners. They even go as far as to paint figural representations on their walls and have them in their buildings and houses. This should suffice as evidence to the observer of their state of subjugation and domination. And I would like to note here that this appears in both the earliest form of the Muqaddimah, the earliest version, written in 1377, and in the final recension that was composed in his own hand in Egypt. So this was clearly a passage he deemed worthy of inclusion in all of the passages of the Muqaddimah that have come down to us. So both of these individuals, Jean II of Aragon and the scholar-statesman Ibn Khaldun, although writing in two distinct contexts and each with their own motivations, portrayed Nasr Granada, the last surviving Muslim kingdom in Iberia, as existing on the margins of the Islamic world. Its inhabitants were classified as renegades and apostates, whose transgression of religious boundaries was an affront to Christendom, or as a subjugated people whose cultural assimilation reflected the absence of social and political cohesion, or asabiya. These statements sought to cast doubt on the Islamic identity and legitimacy of the inhabitants of Nasr Granada on the basis of their proximity to and affiliation with Latin Christendom. These declarations by Jean II and Ibn Khaldun throw into very sharp relief the repeated emphasis by late medieval Granadan authors of the Nasr kingdom's religious and genealogical integrity, territorial autonomy, and distinctive ethno-cultural identity. Genealogical notions of Arabness, or Urubiyya, which expressed Islamic identity in terms of Arab lineage, structured this process of identity formation in Nasr Granada. For many Nasrid authors, Urubiyya referred simultaneously to an expansive set of shared cultural and social traits tied closely with Islamic identity, urbanization, law, and kingship, and to an ethnic community bound by language and lineage. For Ibn al-Khaṭīb, Arabness is a recurring theme, which is evident throughout his writings, but is particularly evident in this declaration on several occasions that the lineages of the inhabitants of Granada are Arab. Ansabuhum Arabiya. He says this repeatedly. While invoking his own authority as Nasrid chancellor, who had access to, quote, the legal, official, and royal documents that provided evidence for his assertion, Ibn al-Khaṭīb proclaimed that the ubiquity of Arab tribal patronyms was sufficient evidence for the nobility and purity of descent, and constituted clear evidence for the Arabness of the inhabitants of Granada. Arabness then here serves as an organizing principle, I should say, for identity and memory, and a discourse of legitimation in Nasr Granada that was communicated through various means: the composition of local history, biographical compendia, royal genealogy and dynastic chronicles, poetry, legal documents and records, inscriptions, family history, and also autobiography, which has remained understudied, unfortunately. And the opening pages of the Comprehensive History of Granada, a monumental biographical dictionary written by Ibn al-Khaṭīb, is a particularly significant illustration of how the composition of local history was intimately connected with genealogy and the process of the articulation of communal memory. And here he says, after witnessing the numerous works of history lovingly and loyally dedicated to scholars, by scholars of their homeland, I was possessed with a strong sense of pride and partisanship for my own people, a feeling that cannot be considered blameworthy by any religious or moral standards, and realized that this city has been chosen by God as a borderland of Islam and the residence of the Arab notables, the tribal kin of his prophet. Moreover, it has the distinction of belonging to the middle clime, being blessed with flowing rivers, extensive urban settlement, and entire forests of trees. The noble Arabs settled there and established the foundations of its urban institutions and fiscal administration. They expanded its urban settlements and produced numerous descendants, accomplishing glorious deeds and perpetuating their virtue until it became the abode of kingship, Dar al-Mulk. That's referring to the foundation of the Nasr kingdom. So this is a foundational passage. This is in the very beginning of the monumental comprehensive history, which was a 12-volume work on Granada. So this exaltation of the virtues of Granada might not be too surprising. It draws upon religious, ethnological, and genealogical ideas to celebrate the preeminence of the city. We can see this across the medieval world, such statements. But it's the portrayal of Nasr Granada as a borderland of Islam and populated by the Arab notables, the tribal kin of Muhammad, which illustrates the close alignment of religious identity and genealogical descent. Significantly ascribe this Islamic identity to genealogical descent from particular bloodlines, Arab Muslim bloodlines, notably those Damascene Umayyad battalions that settled in southern Spain during the mid-8th century. The idea of the perpetuation of cultural traits and social privilege through the reproduction across generations of particular Arab Muslim bloodlines reflected the centrality of genealogical thinking within Andalusi discourses about identity and memory during the Middle Ages. And the construction of Nasr Granada as an idealized community characterized by genealogical continuity, religious exclusivity, and ethnic cohesion is most clearly expressed in this other passage. The inhabitants of this land, he tells us, are distinguished, this is from also the preface, by their truly magnificent devotion to the faith and the correctness of their doctrinal beliefs, such that heresy and deviant sects are non-existent. They all faithfully adhere to the legal school of Malik, the Imam of the abode of immigration. They maintain their loyal obedience and fealty to the sovereigns and lords. They pay their taxes on time. They possess handsome physical features, etc., etc. The passage here that's crucial is they speak eloquent Arabic, which has been permeated by various local expressions and colloquialisms, and their conduct and virtues are exemplary. Their lineages are Arab, but many among them are Berbers and immigrants. Right? There's so much happening here that we can talk about, and this also appears in the Lamh al-Badriya, one of his other works. So there's so much I can say about this passage, but I want to draw your attention to one particular aspect. The definition of the boundaries of community through the adherence to the Maliki school of law forged a Granadan identity that was defined by religious exclusivity, which deliberately excluded Christian and Jewish communities that resided within the kingdom from participating in this idea of being Granadan. These ideas were employed by Ibn al-Khaṭīb to underscore the unity of belief, the enforcement of orthodox Islamic doctrine and practice, and austere piety, which he sought to represent as a defining aspect of religiosity. Arabness, especially in the ways that it was tied to Islamic exclusivity, and that was a choice. There was a large discourse about Arabness throughout the Islamic world. Here, it's tied to genealogy and it's tied to Islamic identity, was predicated on the erasure from Andalusi collective memory of any genealogical connections, cultural links, or kinship ties with Hispano-Roman, Visigothic, or Amazigh populations during the 14th century, even as Iberia and North Africa were tied even more closely together during this period. And this involved the omission and erasure of Christian ancestries and lineages. And I'm transitioning here to the second part of my talk. From the collective memory of Andalusi Muslims, populations from whom many of these communities may have descended. I'm not interested in resolving that question. I don't find it that interesting. In other words, Arabness, which was mapped onto notions of religious lineage, sought to negate any possible kinship or affiliation with the Iberian Christian kingdoms and their inhabitants. This can be seen in particular in Ibn al-Khaṭīb's extensive narration and justification of the violent expulsion of the Christian populations in the region to North Africa during the early 12th century. Although there have been excellent studies on the topic by Mary Belfiero, Delfina Serrano, and Vincent Lagarde, this historical episode from the 12th century remains very understudied. For today, my interest lies primarily in the work that invoking this sought to do for Ibn al-Khaṭīb during the 14th century, 200 years later. The local Christians, he tells us, al-Nasara al-Mu'ahidin, are described in the preface of the comprehensive history as essentially comprising the majority of the population of the region during the Umayyad era, as we would expect, organized into distinct communities administered by Christian magnates and officials, and represented as tax-paying subjects of one particular group of Arab Muslim conquerors, that same group, the Damascene Jund, that Ibn al-Khaṭīb claims all Granadans descend from. He emphasizes that this state of affairs, which lasted for over 400 years, was annulled during the early 12th century, when the descendants of these local Christians were expelled en masse to North Africa, and their properties, including churches, were either destroyed or confiscated. The narrative seeks to legitimate and justify this course of action by portraying the local Christians as active and willing collaborators of Alfonso I of Aragon during his devastating military campaigns in the region. Following earlier authors, Ibn al-Khaṭīb, citing no less a juridical authority than Ibn Rushd al-Jadd, died in 1126, the grandfather of Averroes, proclaimed that their quote-unquote treachery and deceit necessitated their expulsion from the region. Although much of the information itself is drawn from earlier chronicles, the way in which the material is organized and its mobilization to frame the entire history of Granada is particularly novel. The very fact that Ibn al-Khaṭīb incorporated such a sustained discussion, 7 pages long in the printed edition, of these events into the preface of the comprehensive history is highly significant. This is longer than all of his description of the traits of Granadans combined, just to give you a sense of this. Is highly significant. It would be reproduced almost verbatim within the Hulal al-Mawshiyah, an influential historical chronicle written by another Nasr scholar official, Ibn Simak al-Amili, who was one of Ibn al-Khaṭīb's students and proteges. For too long, these two sources are considered separate by historians who use them both to justify a particular understanding of the 12th century. I think this is pretty problematic for all sorts of reasons. So Ibn Simak also has an 8-page kind of discussion of these events and had the same narrative, right? Mozarab conspiracy and rebellion, Alfonso I's campaigns, Ibn Rushd's fatwa, followed by expulsion and deportation of all Andalusi Christians to Morocco. Both texts have often been utilized uncritically within modern scholarship, forming the basis of modern historical accounts and narratives, often replicating many of the claims and, more disturbingly, the language employed by Ibn al-Khaṭīb as a source for the historical circumstances surrounding the elimination of the Mozarab communities in the region during the 12th century. The exceptions, of course, are those I've already noted. There is some good critical scholarship, but it's also contributed to the reproduction of Ibn al-Khaṭīb's grand narrative of Granadan history within modern scholarship. This reflects a lack of awareness of the very nature of the endeavor that Ibn al-Khaṭīb was engaged in. He was not interested in recording with veracity the events of the 12th century. The emphasis on the disappearance of local Christians, which we should not take as historical fact, reflected the crystallization of a triumphalist historical narrative about the complete Islamization of Granada by around 1200. And remember the context I referred to earlier here. It sought to counteract accusations from contemporaries in North Africa and the Near East by illustrating the militant defense of the faith, genealogical purity, and ethnic cohesion that shaped Andalusi efforts, both past and present, to maintain a commitment to Islamic exclusivity. The expulsion of the Mozarabs is transformed by Ibn al-Khaṭīb from a single, albeit important, historical episode during the Almoravid period into the centerpiece of a narrative of Granada's religious and ethnic homogeneity. The detailed discussion of this event in the preface reflected the ways in which Ibn al-Khaṭīb constructed the boundaries of legitimate community in Granada through the articulation of a discourse about religious identity, lineage, and loyalty. It is significant that the primary emphasis is upon forced exile and expulsion, and not on forced conversion, which is not acknowledged or discussed throughout the comprehensive history. It's also significant he does not talk about the forced conversion of the Jewish and Christian communities of Granada under the Almohads, for example. Conversion is not the goal here. We are simply told that the Mozarabs perished through plague, famine, and enslavement during the perilous journey to North Africa, and that is how God deals with rebels. Right? This is all he tells us, right? Throughout the comprehensive history and many of his other work, Christians do appear, but primarily as foreign enemies and enslaved peoples, and occasionally as merchants or mercenaries, but rarely as progenitors of local lineages or families. This exclusionary representation of Granada identity, which is tied to that idea of Arabness that I mentioned, should also be seen as reflecting, and this is maybe something we can discuss and talk about, the impact of Almoravid's policies of deportation and expulsion, and the legacies, more importantly, of Almohad homogenization and forced conversion during the late Middle Ages. Nasrid authors such as al-Khaṭīb sought to contend with these legacies and histories within their own particular political and cultural contexts. Indeed, the reports of the ambassadors of Jean II to Pope Clement may also have been implicitly referencing these legacies, I would like to suggest, especially the reference to the alleged Christian ancestors of most of the inhabitants of Granada. While the mothers and fathers may refer to enslaved peoples, the great-great-grandfathers and the great-great-grandmothers may be referring to those Mozarabs. So this is really significant here in light of the fact that the comprehensive history has a grand total of 0 biographies of a Christian. Not one Christian appears in the comprehensive history, even though this is supposed to be a comprehensive history of Granada. Some Jewish figures appear. And the lack of Christians is particularly stark given their major intellectual contributions to the Arabic literary and philosophical tradition in Al-Andalus throughout the centuries. And this should be understood alongside the privileging of centuring of genealogical notions of Arabness. And one last point, if I may, Luke. The descent of Andalusian Muslims from Jewish and Christian communities, if acknowledged at all, was primarily invoked by al-Khaṭīb as a marker of religious deviance and disloyalty, which is evident in one major case known to everyone here, the rebellion of the Andalusi Muwallad Umar bin Hafsun, who led a rebellion against the Umayyads in the late 9th and early 10th centuries. The latter's Christian ancestry is not only highlighted in al-Khaṭīb through the direct identification of several alleged ancestors with Latin names, and by the explicit mention that his great-grandfather was a convert to Islam, one of the rare times that al-Khaṭīb talks about conversion. But as David Wasserstein has observed, this is probably, as when he was writing, the only case in the history of Al-Andalus where the pre-Islamic ancestry of a Muslim individual is extensively recorded as part of their genealogy. And this is something to keep in mind. So the integration of his ancestry into larger narratives about his role in fomenting discord and sedition illustrates his mobilization of genealogy to make claims about loyalty and religious identity. So we should not look at when he talks about the absence of Christians or Christian ancestors as some kind of an objective fact or an attempt to discuss this. And another example can be seen in the discussion of Ibn Hamushk. There's plenty of examples I can talk about. But to conclude, one last sort of word by way of conclusion, and I skipped a few things. This is just really an attempt to help us think about his corpus. There's so much more I could add, but I won't go into it. But this was an upwardly mobile individual whose intimate social and political network did include Jewish physicians, Andalusi nobles, Castilian converts to Islam, Berber sovereigns and scholars, and many formerly enslaved peoples. So his writings are marked with contradiction and tension. The formulation of his identity around this notion of genealogical continuity and religious purity reflected his own anxieties and preoccupations, his mystical and philosophical proclivities, his close associations with Jewish astrologers and physicians, rendered his Islamic commitments quite suspect in the eyes of many jurists and theologians. Significantly, shortly after the completion of the comprehensive history of Granada, which he actually sends to the East, where it's deposited in one of the royal libraries, Ibn al-Khaṭīb would be accused by his detractors within the Nasrid court of heresy and of disloyalty and of having no genealogy. These accusations would culminate in the public burning of his works, the confiscation of his properties, and his eventual assassination in Fez in 1374. It doesn't end there. His body was then disinterred and then burnt, right? So this is a very, very much characteristic way of how people in medieval Granada dealt with dhimmis, foreign officials who were of dhimmi background, and he was treated the same way. This is a larger conversation I can have. And this reflects the ways in which these categories and discourses were malleable, right? These ideas of inclusion and exclusion, which he spent his entire life cultivating, were essentially turned, onto their maker, so to speak, and shows how fraught, these discourses could be in the politics of Granada and its wider world during the 14th century. Thank you for your patience with my rendering.